Well, it's such a nice day out. I thought I'd stand outside and do a little talk about state diversity and the introduction with a nice landscape behind us. So just want to give an introduction about why different states have different types of public policies and why different localities as well. I'm going to focus primarily on states right now. And we're going to go through a number of different segments of this as we examine state diversity. So the very first thing that we want to take a look at is an overview of the different types of things that might affect policy as it comes out in state and local governments. What we're going to focus on today is geography and demographics and a little bit about region. And then we'll get more in depth on political culture and social capital and economy in the next module. So this module again focuses on the first three things that we have here. So one of the biggest things that we know that affects the way that we have public policies in states is the wealth of an individual state. The wealthier a state is, the more tax resources it has to tax. As a consequence of that, it can spend more money. So if we take a look here, we see that the average income versus the average per capita expenses, or I'm sorry, not average, median, meaning middle, and the per capita expenditures, meaning how much does each state pay out per person within the state. We see that Connecticut is the wealthiest state in the country with a median household income of about $71,000, which compares to $51,000 across the United States. Mississippi tends to be the poorest state in the United States almost year after year generally, and their per capita household income or median household income is $36,000. We're right around the middle here in Pennsylvania. New Jersey's a bit wealthier, particularly up around the New York, kind of the bedroom communities for New York City up in northern New Jersey. Now, what you see here then is a wealthy state like Connecticut has the ability, because they have so much to tax, to be able to spend more on services for its residents. Now, if you take a look at this map, you might say to yourself, well, it's kind of funny there at the bottom that it says that Mississippi actually spends more per capita than does Pennsylvania. And there's a reason for that. Mississippi, because it is such a poor state, actually gets quite a bit of money from the federal government. And there are a number of programs that are big income exchanges, or what we call intergovernmental transfers from the federal government to states. And there are things like Medicaid, which is a program for poorer people to get health insurance, a lot more in relationship to what we call welfare transfers, dealing with both temporary assistance for needy families and things like food stamps, in addition to elementary and secondary education. So some states are very much helped by wealth distributions between different states, whereby the federal government creates the federal taxes, takes the money in, and then gives it to poorer states. And that's the case with Mississippi. But again, in general, states that have more ability to tax because they have more wealth are the ones that spend more on things like education and various other programs within their state. What about some other kind of more geographical factors? We can take a look at states. So, if you compare Rhode Island and Alaska, you see that Alaska is more than 500,000 square miles compared to Rhode Island, which is only 2,700 square miles. We rank 32nd. Pennsylvania is a pretty big state. We rank 32nd out of the 50 states at 44,817 square miles. One of the big things that's important for states is how much of their land is actually owned by the federal government. And what we see is that, there are a couple of states who are profoundly affected by the federal government because much of their state is owned by the federal government, and therefore federal policies on those federal lands greatly influence what happens in the economies of those states. So Nevada, for example, is 84.5% owned by the federal government. Alaska is almost 70% owned by the federal government. What we see generally, if we take a look at this, you'll see Pennsylvania is only 2.5%. Most of our things that are owned by the federal government are some forests here, and smaller things like historical battlefields, Gettysburg and Valley Forge and things like that. But if you take a look way out west, you'll see that there's an enormous amount of different types of federal agencies that are controlling land. And states like Utah, and Nevada, and Idaho, and Wyoming are predominantly owned by the federal government. And that affects the policies in those states, right? So if the federal government takes over a piece of land or occupies a piece of land, it can decide what happens on that piece of land. Can you, for example, mine in that area? Can you take timber down in that area? Can you raise cattle in that area? What are you allowed to hunt in that area? What's an endangered species on that area? So what we see is a vastly different kind of mentality in the western part of the United States to the federal government, because so much of their life is actually controlled by what the federal government says can happen on federal lands. And as a consequence of that, it really affects their politics. Another thing to take a look at is U.S. population density. So here's a map by counties. And what we see is that for the most part, our population density is in a couple of different areas of the country. One, what we would call this kind of I-95 corridor, which runs basically from a little south of Washington, D.C., the whole way up into Boston. And that's where a huge swatch of America lives. And then we have higher densities on the western coast, particularly in California as you go up. And the closer you are to the coastal areas, the more likely there is to be population. And then we've got population in South Florida as well. What you see generally out in the plain states and the western states is very low population density. And of course, you can imagine that there's a lot of different public policies that then are affected by how many people live close to each other. So, for example, New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the country. Their population per square mile of land is 1,196. Pennsylvania is a relatively rural state. We have 283 people per square mile. And then you get down to a state like Alaska that only has 1.2 people per square mile. So, this again has effects on the way the policy is carried out in these various states. One thing that we see also is population change over time. We've seen certain areas of the country which tend to have high population growths. Over the last, say, 50 to 60 years, the South and the West, or what we call the Sun Belt, have been most likely to be growing. And typically in the Northeast and the Midwest, we've seen populations stagnating over that period of time. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, our population pretty much has stayed relatively stable over the last 50 or 60 years. And, that compared to states like Florida, Texas, California, although California is starting to slow down. Arizona is a hot state. Nevada is a hot state. We've seen huge population change. And with that comes the need to provide different types of services, right? So if you're all of a sudden in a state in which there's a lot of economic development and a lot of new people moving in for jobs, you've got to build new infrastructure, new schools. That's a different focus than we'd have on a slow-growing state like Pennsylvania, where we're more interested in trying to attract new people and focus on really what our legacy kind of infrastructure projects are. Here's a good example of changing populations. You'll see, for example, here at the bottom, West Virginia is losing population. Pennsylvania, again, relatively flat. And then you have states like Nevada, in which their population gain has been enormous over the last several decades. Nevada is still a relatively small state as far as population. There are a couple of centers, Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is, and then up near Tahoe in Reno, there are population centers, but there's an enormous amount of area for people to be able to move there. All of this affects the policies of these different states. Another thing is the educational attainment of a specific area. So here's a chart done from the American Community Studies on the percentage of adults from 25 to 34 that have a college degree, a bachelor's degree, a four-year degree, as of 2018. Now, this is slightly distorted because younger people were more likely to have college degrees than the population is at large. So if I was able to get a map here that said 25 to 64 years old, we'd see kind of differences. but we do see kind of a concentration of education in specific areas. And the Northeast, or again, that I-95 corridor, is home to a lot of educated people, as is the West Coast, and then the upper Midwest as well. And Colorado is a pretty high-tech area, particularly in the Boulder, Denver metropolitan areas there. So they've got a little bit more education than other states. And typically, southern states have lower levels of college education. And again, that makes a big difference, because the more education you have, the more likely you are to have a higher income, and the higher income you are, the more likely you are to pay more taxes, which gives you more of a tax base, which allows you to have more government programs. Here's a breakdown in Pennsylvania and overall counties throughout the United States. But you'll see that the most educated parts of Pennsylvania are here in the southeastern part of the state, with Philadelphia having relatively low, inside the city of Philadelphia itself, because of poverty, a relatively low amount of people with college degrees. But the collar counties, or what we call the ring counties, Bucks, Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware County, all have high levels of educational attainment. And then you'll see out west in the Pittsburgh area, which is Allegheny County, you'll see a lot of educated people there. And you'll see that one educated, that one spot right in the middle there, Center County, which indescribably has a lot of educated people. If you know what's in Center County, it's Penn State. So that's why that kind of is an outlier right there. Then the rural areas of the state tend to have less college graduates. Again, that has a profound effect on what types of businesses that you can attract, and again, also on your tax base. Age is important as well. As we'll find out this semester, Pennsylvania is one of the oldest states in the country. We are in 5th place here, I guess, 6th place. Florida, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, West Virginia are all older than us, but we are steadily growing older in Pennsylvania, which is a problem, because as you get more older people, they're usually people that rely on social services to be able to get by, things like Medicaid and various other programs for older people that cost money. And they're generally not paying into the tax system because they are retired at that point in time. So that causes a whole different kind of problems in public policy than it would be if you were a much younger state with a lot of people contributing to the tax base. Another interesting thing to take a look at is the percentage of foreign-born residents by state and by county. So here's a map showing these percentages from 2013 to 2018, and essentially what we see is that there is a much larger amount of immigrant populations, particularly in the Southwest and into California, and we have also in Southern Florida. And then you see some of that around the New York metropolitan region as well, and Washington, D.C. So the amount of immigrants in the United States is very much kind of concentrated in certain areas of the country. That's not to say that there isn't immigration in other parts, but the higher amounts of immigration. And that, of course, affects things like, type of educational spending that you have, what type of educational policies do you have, particularly trying to reach students who English might be a second language, and government services provided in multilingual aspects. So that's an important ingredient as well. And then finally, the political beliefs of people obviously change by states. So take a look at the Gallup poll ideology from 2018, and you'll see that there are a number of states here that are very conservative. They're the deep red. There are a couple of states that are more liberal than others. They are deep blue, and then there's the more or less conservative or more or less liberal, and then the just about average. And we see that, the conservative areas of the country really run down through the South into the upper mountain states, and New England and the West Coast tend to be the most liberal areas of the country. As you'll see here, Pennsylvania is interesting, we'll talk about this at another time, but ideologically, generally the East and the Pittsburgh, Allegheny area is relatively liberal, and then the rest of the state's pretty conservative. But as with many things with Pennsylvania, we're always about average, so we're gray here, right? So let me just show you one other thing, is that if we go and we take a look at the electoral college maps from recent elections, we'll see again that you can see the interesting kind of way in which Pennsylvania is divided up ideologically. So this is the result of 2016 election, presidential election by county. And you'll see that the red states, I mean, there are areas up here in Elk County, Potter County, Warren County. There are areas, you know, we're talking about in the neighborhood of somewhere between, you know, 65 and 80% voting for Donald Trump and voting Republican. Then you get down here to the ring counties around Philadelphia, and this is where a lot of the population is in the state of Pennsylvania, very highly Democratic. Then you see in Philadelphia itself that Hillary Clinton won 82 to 15%. So we certainly know that the city of Philadelphia is very Democratic. And you see right there that Clinton got, you know, 480,000 more votes in Philadelphia than did Donald Trump. That's an enormous amount. If you took Philadelphia out of the state of Pennsylvania, it would be a red state, hands down, right? And just to take a look again at the entire country from the electoral map perspective, what we see is that, you know, ideology that we saw in that table earlier from Gallup pretty much neatly fits over top of the electoral college here. So, you know, mostly see kind of the, you know, northeast of the U.S. and the West Coast going Democratic, and then the rest of the country being Republican, with a couple, you know, things out in the Midwest. Typically since 1988, with the exception of 2016, Pennsylvania has been Democratic. Traditionally, Wisconsin and Michigan have also been Democratic as well. So that kind of New England down through up into the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic has traditionally been Democratic strongholds in recent presidential elections. So that's just an introduction to some of the things that we know affect elections, affect state policy, and we'll pick up and talk a little bit more about political culture and some other things in upcoming